The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace, as tourists began gathering for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood three college friends from Australia, Jake, Marcus, and Tyler, who had saved for months to experience London's royal traditions. They carried expensive cameras and wore matching Aussie adventure T-shirts that made them stand out among the more conservatively dressed European visitors. The trio had arrived early to secure the best viewing spots near the palace gates. Jake, the self-proclaimed leader of their group, was already live-streaming on his social media accounts, boasting to his followers about how they were going to make this trip unforgettable. He had gained quite a following back home with his outrageous pranks and daredevil stunts, and London was supposed to be his biggest stage yet. As they waited, Marcus noticed the stern-faced guards in their iconic red tunics and tall bearskin hats taking their positions. These weren't just ceremonial figures. They were active-duty soldiers from elite regiments like the Grenadier Guards and Coldstream Guards, trained professionals who had served in combat zones around the world. But to the three tourists, they looked like living museum pieces, perfect targets for some harmless fun. Tyler, usually the voice of reason in their group, felt a nagging worry as he watched Jake's eyes light up with mischief. He had seen that look before, and it rarely ended well. The last time Jake had that expression, they had ended up running from security guards at Sydney Opera House after Jake tried to climb the iconic shelves for a selfie. But Tyler's concerns were drowned out by the excited chatter of the growing crowd and Jake's enthusiastic planning. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, as hundreds of tourists pressed against the barriers, cameras ready to capture every moment of the centuries-old ceremony. Street vendors sold Union Jack souvenirs, while tour guides explained the historical significance of the ritual to their groups in multiple languages. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, wide-eyed with wonder at the spectacle they were about to witness. Jake pulled out his phone and started recording, whispering excitedly to his camera about his secret plan to make these stuffy guards crack a smile. He had researched online and found countless videos of tourists trying to distract the Queen's Guard, most failing miserably. But Jake was confident he would be different. He had charisma, he had timing, and most importantly, he had no fear of embarrassment. Marcus, caught up in his friend's enthusiasm, began suggesting increasingly elaborate ways to get the guards' attention. He had always been Jake's eager accomplice, never wanting to be left out of the adventure. The two friends fed off each other's energy, their voices growing louder and more animated as they plotted their approach. The first guard they focused on was a tall, imposing figure standing at attention near the main gate. Guardsman Thompson, though his name was unknown to the tourists, was a decorated veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan. He had joined the household division after completing his service with distinction, earning the right to wear the prestigious uniform through years of rigorous training and unwavering dedication to duty. As the ceremony's start time approached, Thompson could sense the shift in the crowd's energy. He had experienced this countless times before. Tourists who mistook the pomp and pageantry for entertainment, rather than the serious military tradition it represented. His trained eyes had already identified the 3 Australians as potential troublemakers, their body language and excited whispers marking them as clearly as if they wore signs. The morning breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers from the palace gardens, mixing with the urban aromas of London traffic and street food. Double-decker buses rumbled past on the nearby roads while black cabs honked their way through the congested streets. It was a perfect London morning, and the stage was set for what would become one of the most memorable and regrettable tourist encounters in recent palace history. Thompson's fellow guardsmen had also noticed the 3 young men, and subtle glances were exchanged between the soldiers. They had developed an almost telepathic communication system during their training, able to alert each other to potential issues without breaking their stoic facades. The guards were ready for whatever these tourists might attempt, their experience having taught them to expect the unexpected while maintaining their unwavering professional composure. Jake couldn't contain his excitement any longer as the ceremony officially began. The sound of military bands echoed across the palace grounds, their brass instruments creating a majestic soundtrack that sent chills through the crowd. But instead of being swept up in the grandeur of the moment like everyone else, Jake saw only an opportunity to create viral content. He started small, making exaggerated gestures and silly faces while posing next to Guardsman Thompson. The soldier remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead as if Jake didn't exist. This only encouraged Jake further, who interpreted the guard's stoic response as a challenge rather than professionalism. He began narrating his actions to his phone camera, describing the guard like a zoo animal for his online audience. Marcus joined in, positioning himself on the other side of Thompson and mimicking the guard's rigid posture in an exaggerated, mocking manner. He puffed out his chest comically and stood at an absurd attention position, drawing giggles from some nearby tourists who initially found the antics amusing. The friends were feeding off the crowd's reaction, mistaking nervous laughter for genuine entertainment. Tyler watched from a few feet away, his stomach knotting with anxiety. He tried to signal his friends to tone it down, but they were too caught up in their performance to notice his worried expressions. Other tourists began pulling out their phones to record the spectacle, some laughing while others looked disapproving. The scene was quickly spiraling beyond a harmless joke into something more serious. Guardsman Thompson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign of his growing irritation. He had endured worse provocations during his years of service, but something about these particular tourists struck him as especially disrespectful. Their behavior wasn't just silly, it was mocking the uniform, the crown, and everything he had sworn to protect. His military training kept him motionless, but his mind was cataloging every action for potential consequences. The ceremony continued around them, with other guards marching in perfect formation, while the band played traditional military marches. The contrast between the dignified proceedings and the tourist's juvenile behavior became more stark by the minute. Palace officials in the distance had begun to take notice, their concerned expressions visible even from afar. Jake decided to escalate his performance, pulling out props he had brought specifically for this moment. He produced a plastic crown from his backpack and placed it mockingly on his head, then began performing an exaggerated royal wave to the crowd. Some tourists cheered, but others began to look uncomfortable as they realized the joke was crossing into disrespectful territory. The situation grew more tense when Jake approached Thompson directly, standing just inches from the guard's face while making ridiculous expressions. He stuck out his tongue, crossed his eyes, and made kissing motions at the stoic soldier. Marcus recorded everything on his phone, encouraging his friend to push further while providing running commentary that grew increasingly crude. A British family nearby tried to move away from the commotion, the parents clearly uncomfortable with exposing their children to the inappropriate behavior. An elderly veteran wearing military medals shook his head in disgust, muttering something about disrespectful colonials under his breath. The mood in their section of the crowd was beginning to shift from amusement to embarrassment and anger. Thompson's training had prepared him for many situations, but the prolonged nature of this harassment was testing even his legendary patience. Sweat beaded on his forehead beneath his heavy bearskin hat, though whether from the physical strain of maintaining position or from the effort of controlling his temper was unclear. His breathing remained controlled, but those who looked closely could see the slight flaring of his nostrils. The palace security team had been monitoring the situation through discreet cameras and plainclothes. Officers scattered throughout the crowd. Radio chatter increased as supervisors debated when to intervene. The guards were trained to handle disruptions themselves when possible, but the international nature of the incident and the presence of recording devices complicated the decision-making process. Jake, completely oblivious to the growing tension around him, decided to attempt his most audacious move yet. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a rubber chicken, apparently planning to use it as a prop in his next bit of mockery. The sight of the ridiculous toy somehow made the situation even more absurd and offensive, a plastic representation of how little respect these tourists had for the ancient traditions they were witnessing. The moment had arrived when something would have to give. The carefully maintained balance between public access and royal dignity was about to be tested in a way that would leave everyone involved forever changed. Jake waved the rubber chicken inches from Guardsman Thompson's face, making ridiculous sound effects while Marcus captured every moment on video. The crowd around them had grown noticeably larger as word spread through the tourist groups about the spectacle taking place. Some visitors were filming with their phones, creating a perfect storm of documentation that would soon spread far beyond the palace gates. What Jake didn't realize was that his harmless fun had already crossed several serious boundaries. British law strictly prohibits interfering with military personnel on duty, and the Queen's Guard holds a special protected status that carries severe penalties for harassment. His actions weren't just rude, they were becoming criminal, with each passing moment adding to the potential charges he could face. The rubber chicken incident pushed Thompson beyond his breaking point. After 20 minutes of enduring the mockery, the decorated soldier made a decision that would change everything. His eyes, which had remained fixed straight ahead throughout the ordeal, suddenly snapped down to make direct contact with Jake's shocked gaze. The intensity of that stare was enough to freeze the tourist mid-laugh, the rubber chicken suddenly feeling heavy in his trembling hand. Thompson's voice, when it finally came, cut through the morning air like a blade. His words were measured, precise, and delivered with the full authority of someone who had commanded respect in war zones around the world. He informed Jake in no uncertain terms that his behavior was unacceptable, and that immediate consequences would follow if it continued. The guard's tone carried undertones of barely controlled fury that made even the bravest spectators take a step back. The transformation in Thompson was remarkable to witness. One moment he had been a statue-like figure, and the next he was every inch the combat veteran and professional soldier that he truly was. His posture shifted slightly, becoming somehow even more imposing, while his presence seemed to fill the space around him with an almost physical weight of authority. Jake's confident smirk faltered as the reality of his situation began to sink in. The guard's response wasn't the gentle scolding he had expected. It was the stern rebuke of a man who had earned his position through years of service and sacrifice. The rubber chicken slipped from Jake's suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the cobblestones with a pathetic squeak that seemed to punctuate the moment perfectly. Marcus, still recording, found his hands shaking as he captured his friend's obvious distress. The power dynamic had shifted completely in just a few seconds, and what had seemed like harmless fun now felt dangerous and wrong. Other tourists began backing away, sensing that they were about to witness something significant and potentially unpleasant. Thompson's fellow guards had also subtly adjusted their positions, creating a loose formation that effectively surrounded the three Australians, without appearing to do so obviously. Years of coordinated training allowed them to move as one unit, while maintaining their individual posts. A display of military precision that was both impressive and intimidating. The palace security team finally moved into action, their plainclothes officers beginning to close in on the group, while uniformed personnel approached from multiple directions. The decision had been made at the highest levels that this situation required immediate intervention before it could escalate further or inspire copycat behavior from other tourists. Jake tried to laugh off the guard's warning, attempting to return to his previous bravado, but his voice cracked with nervousness. He looked around desperately for support from the crowd, but found only disapproving faces and people actively moving away from him. The isolation was complete. He had gone from entertainer to pariah in the span of a few moments. Tyler finally found his voice and tried to convince his friends to leave immediately, grabbing Marcus's arm and attempting to pull him away from the scene. But it was already too late for a quiet exit. The wheels of British justice had begun to turn, and there would be no escaping the consequences of their actions through simple retreat. The atmosphere around them had become electric with tension, the kind of charged air that precedes a thunderstorm. Even the ongoing ceremony seemed to have taken on a more serious tone, as if the very stones of Buckingham Palace were expressing their disapproval of the disrespect they had witnessed. A senior palace official approached the scene, his formal attire and official bearing marking him as someone with real authority. His expression was grim as he surveyed the situation, taking in the scattered props, the recording devices, and the obvious distress of all parties involved. This was no longer a simple tourist incident. It had become an international diplomatic situation that would require careful handling. Jake finally understood that he had made a terrible mistake. But understanding came too late to change anything. The consequences were already in motion, and all he could do was wait to discover just how severely his moment of foolishness would impact his life. The senior palace official introduced himself as Inspector Davies from the Royal Protection Unit, his credentials immediately establishing the gravity of the situation. His voice carried the weight of decades spent protecting the royal family and maintaining the dignity of the crown. He informed the three Australians that their behavior had been recorded by multiple security cameras and that formal, Complaints had been filed by several witnesses. Jake's attempt to explain that it was just a joke fell on deaf ears as Inspector Davies methodically outlined the various laws they had potentially broken. The list was longer than any of them had imagined. Harassment of military personnel, disturbing the peace, public disorder, and violation of the special protections afforded to royal premises. Each charge carried serious penalties, including possible imprisonment and mandatory deportation. The inspector's words hit the three friends like physical blows as they realized the true scope of their legal predicament. Marcus stopped filming entirely, his phone hanging limp in his hand as he processed the information. Tyler had gone pale, his worst fears about this trip suddenly seeming prophetic. The vacation they had saved for and planned for months was turning into a nightmare before their eyes. Guardsman Thompson remained at his post throughout the official proceedings, but his earlier intervention had clearly communicated to his superiors that this incident required serious attention. The respect and deference shown to him by the inspector demonstrated the high regard in which the Queen's guard was held within the royal protection hierarchy. A crowd of curious onlookers had gathered at a respectful distance, many of them recording the aftermath of the incident on their phones. The three Australians found themselves at the center of unwanted attention, their faces being captured from multiple angles by strangers who would undoubtedly share the footage online within hours. Inspector Davies produced an official incident report form and began documenting everything that had occurred, taking statements from witnesses and recording the serial numbers of the confiscated props. The bureaucratic process was thorough and intimidating, each official stamp and signature adding weight to the charges being compiled against them. The inspector explained that while the palace preferred to handle such matters quietly when possible, the public nature of the incident and the extensive video evidence made a formal response unavoidable. The footage that Marcus and others had recorded would now serve as evidence against them rather than the entertaining content they had intended to create. Jake tried desperately to negotiate, offering to delete all the footage and issue public apologies if the charges could be dropped. But Inspector Davies made it clear that the decision was no longer in local hands. The matter would need to be reviewed by higher authorities who took any threat to royal security extremely seriously. No matter how seemingly harmless, the three friends were informed that they would need to accompany officers to a nearby police station for formal processing and that their passports would be temporarily confiscated pending the investigation. The reality of potentially spending their vacation in a British jail cell was beginning to sink in, along with the broader implications for their futures. Tyler asked about contacting the Australian embassy, and Inspector Davies confirmed that diplomatic channels would indeed be notified as required by international protocols. This meant that their embarrassing incident would officially involve both governments, potentially creating a minor diplomatic situation that would be documented and remembered long after their visit ended. The palace's legal team was already being briefed on the situation, preparing for various scenarios depending on how the three tourists chose to respond to the charges. The Crown Prosecution Service would ultimately decide whether to pursue the matter fully, but the extensive evidence and public nature of the incident made serious consequences almost inevitable. As they were escorted away from the palace grounds, Jake caught sight of other tourists watching them with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Some were clearly discussing what they had witnessed, sharing their own recordings and opinions about the incident. The viral fame Jake had sought was indeed becoming reality, but not in the way he had imagined. The ceremony continued around them as if nothing had happened, the remaining guards maintaining their posts while the bands played their traditional marches. The resilience and professionalism of the royal household was on full display, demonstrating that no tourist incident could disrupt the ancient traditions they were sworn to protect. Inspector Davies mentioned that similar incidents had occurred in the past, but few had been as prolonged or as blatantly disrespectful as what they had witnessed that morning. The combination of social media, documentation, and international visitors had created a perfect storm that would require careful handling to avoid escalating into a larger controversy. The three friends faced the sobering realization that their attempt at harmless fun had evolved into a serious legal matter with potential consequences that could follow them for years to come. The police station atmosphere was a stark contrast to the tourist-friendly areas of London the three friends had been enjoying just hours earlier. The sterile fluorescent lighting and institutional green walls created an environment that emphasized the serious nature of their situation. Jake, Marcus, and Tyler sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, each processing their predicament in stunned silence. Detective Superintendent Miller, a veteran officer with extensive experience in handling tourist-related incidents near royal properties, reviewed their case file with the methodical attention of someone who had seen similar situations escalate into international incidents. Her preliminary assessment was not encouraging for the three Australians, as the evidence against them was overwhelming and the charges were well documented. The formal interview process began, with each friend being separated and questioned individually about their actions and motivations. Jake's confident demeanor crumbled under professional interrogation as he was forced to confront the reality that his social media stunt had serious legal implications. His explanations about seeking entertainment value fell flat against the weight of harassment and public disorder charges. Marcus faced additional scrutiny because of his active role in recording and encouraging the incident. The prosecution was particularly interested in his social media accounts and the intention behind documenting the harassment. His phone was seized as evidence, containing not only the palace footage but also planning conversations and previous similar incidents from their travels. Tyler's cooperation and obvious distress worked somewhat in his favor during questioning, but his presence at the scene and failure to intervene made him potentially liable as an accessory to the charges. His repeated expressions of regret and horror at how events had unfolded were noted by investigators but didn't eliminate his legal exposure. The duty solicitor assigned to their case painted a grim picture of their options during the initial legal consultation. The combination of video evidence, witness statements, and the high-profile nature of the incident created a prosecution case that would be difficult to challenge successfully. The lawyer recommended accepting responsibility and hoping for leniency rather than fighting charges that were essentially ironclad. Inspector Davies arrived at the station with additional documentation from the palace, including formal complaints filed by both Guardsman Thompson and senior palace officials. The institutional response demonstrated that this was being treated as a serious security incident rather than a minor tourist infraction, elevating the potential penalties significantly. The Australian High Commission was officially notified of their citizens' detention, triggering diplomatic protocols that would eventually reach high levels of government in both countries. A consular officer was dispatched to provide assistance, but the representative made it clear that diplomatic immunity did not apply to tourist activities and that the Australians would face the full weight of British law. Media attention began building as news of the incident spread through social networks and eventually reached traditional news outlets. The palace incident was being framed as an example of disrespectful tourist behavior, with many commentators expressing outrage at the treatment of the Queen's Guard. The three friends found themselves becoming symbols of entitled tourist behavior at the worst possible time. Jake's social media accounts, which had been the motivation for the entire incident, were quickly discovered by internet investigators who began sharing his previous content and identifying his companions. The viral fame he had sought was indeed materializing, but as notorious troublemakers rather than entertaining personalities. The charges were formally filed after a review by the Crown Prosecution Service, including harassment, public disorder, and violation of special security provisions related to royal premises. Each charge carried potential jail time, substantial fines, and mandatory deportation upon completion of any sentence. The prospect of criminal records that would affect their future travel and employment opportunities became real. Bail was set at a substantial amount that required emergency financial assistance from their families back in Australia. The conditions of their release included surrender of passports, daily reporting requirements, and strict prohibitions on approaching any royal properties or contacting media outlets about their case. Their hotel reservations and planned tourist activities became meaningless as they faced the reality of an extended legal battle in London. The vacation budget they had saved was now being consumed by legal fees, accommodation costs, and the various expenses associated with navigating the British justice system as foreign defendants. The solicitor explained that even if they avoided jail time, the immigration consequences would likely include lifetime bans from entering the United Kingdom and possible difficulties obtaining visas for other countries. The 15 minutes of fame Jake had sought was becoming a lifelong burden that would follow all three of them. Legal experts, interviewed by media outlets, emphasized that the Queen's Guard held special protected status under British law and that harassment of military personnel on duty was treated with particular severity. The incident was being used as an example of why such protections existed and the importance of respecting military service members, regardless of their ceremonial roles. The video footage of their palace incident exploded across social media platforms within 24 hours of their arrest, reaching millions of viewers worldwide. Jake's dream of viral fame became a nightmare as the clips were shared with overwhelmingly negative commentary from viewers who expressed disgust at their disrespectful behavior toward the Queen's Guard and British institutions. News outlets from Australia to America picked up the story, with headlines describing them as entitled tourists and ugly Australians who had embarrassed their country on the international stage. The Australian High Commissioner was forced to issue a public statement distancing the government from their actions and emphasizing that such behavior did not represent Australian values or tourist conduct. Jake's previous social media content was thoroughly investigated by online communities, revealing a pattern of increasingly reckless behavior designed to generate views and followers. His history of pranks and stunts, previously seen by his audience as entertaining, was now being recontextualized as evidence of escalating disrespect for authority and public institutions. The three friends found themselves confined to their shared budget accommodation, unable to venture out without being recognized and confronted by angry members of the public. British citizens, particularly military veterans and their families, expressed outrage at the treatment of the guardsman, with many calling for the maximum possible penalties to be imposed. Marcus discovered that his university back home had launched an investigation into his conduct, potentially threatening his enrollment and future career prospects. The engineering program he was pursuing had strict conduct requirements, and international criminal charges for harassment of military personnel represented exactly the kind of behavior that could result in academic dismissal. Tyler's employer in Australia initiated disciplinary proceedings after becoming aware of his involvement in the incident. The finance company's reputation management team was concerned about the negative publicity associated with having an employee charged with such offenses, particularly given their corporate client sensitivity to public image issues. Support for the three Australians was virtually non-existent, with even their own families expressing embarrassment and disappointment at their behavior. Parents who had been proud to support their sons' European adventure found themselves fielding calls from neighbors and colleagues who had seen the news coverage and wanted explanations for the disgraceful conduct. The Royal British Legion, the UK's leading armed forces charity, issued a statement condemning the harassment of serving military personnel and highlighting the important role played by the Queen's Guard in maintaining British traditions and security. Their intervention elevated the incident from a tourist offense to a broader discussion about respect for military service. Guardsman Thompson became something of a folk hero in the aftermath of the incident, with his restrained but firm response being praised as an example of professional military bearing under pressure. Military blogs and veterans organizations shared his story as an illustration of the dignity and discipline expected of the Queen's Guard even when facing provocation. The palace's handling of the incident was also widely praised, with security experts noting how effectively the situation had been managed to protect both the institution's dignity and the safety of all involved parties. The swift response and thorough documentation were cited as examples of professional security work at the highest level. Online, fundraising campaigns emerged to support military charities in the names of the three Australians, with donors expressing their respect for the Queen's Guard while condemning the tourist behavior. The ironic result was that their actions generated thousands of pounds in donations to causes supporting the very people they had mocked. Death threats and harassment directed at the three friends forced police to increase security at their accommodation and warn them about the dangers of appearing in public. The anger directed toward them was intense and personal, with many people viewing their behavior as an attack on fundamental British values and military honor. International relations experts noted that the incident had created minor diplomatic tensions between Australia and the UK, requiring careful management to prevent broader implications for the country's relationship. The Australian government's quick condemnation of the behavior helped contain the damage, but the incident remained a source of embarrassment in diplomatic circles. Legal commentators predicted that the intense public interest and negative coverage would influence the court's approach to sentencing, potentially resulting in harsher penalties to demonstrate that such behavior would not be tolerated. The need to send a strong message to other potential troublemakers was cited as a factor that would work against the defendants. The incident sparked broader discussions about tourist behavior, social media culture, and the lengths people would go to achieve online fame. Educational institutions began using their case as an example of how poor judgment could have lifelong consequences, particularly when combined with the permanence of internet documentation. Mental health professionals noted the severe psychological impact that such intense negative attention could have on young people, warning about the potential for lasting emotional damage from public shaming campaigns. The three friends were experiencing firsthand how quickly social media fame could transform from blessing to curse. The video footage of their palace incident exploded across social media platforms within 24 hours of their arrest, reaching millions of viewers worldwide. Jake's dream of viral fame became a nightmare as the clips were shared with overwhelmingly negative commentary from viewers who expressed disgust at their disrespectful behavior toward the Queen's Guard and British institutions. News outlets from Australia to America picked up the story, with headlines describing them as entitled tourists and ugly Australians who had embarrassed their country on the international stage. The Australian High Commissioner was forced to issue a public statement distancing the government from their actions and emphasizing that such behavior did not represent Australian values or tourist conduct. Jake's previous social media content was thoroughly investigated by online communities, revealing a pattern of increasingly reckless behavior designed to generate views and followers. His history of pranks and stunts, previously seen by his audience as entertaining, was now being recontextualized as evidence of escalating disrespect for authority and public institutions. The three friends found themselves confined to their shared budget accommodation, unable to venture out without being recognized and confronted by angry members of the public. British citizens, particularly military veterans and their families, expressed outrage at the treatment of the guardsman, with many calling for the maximum possible penalties to be imposed. Marcus discovered that his university back home had launched an investigation into his conduct, potentially threatening his enrollment and future career prospects. The engineering program he was pursuing had strict conduct requirements and international criminal charges for harassment of military personnel represented exactly the kind of behavior that could result in academic dismissal. Tyler's employer in Australia initiated disciplinary proceedings after becoming aware of his involvement in the incident. The finance company's reputation management team was concerned about the negative publicity associated with having an employee charged with such offenses, particularly given their corporate clients' sensitivity to public image issues. Support for the three Australians was virtually non-existent, with even their own families expressing embarrassment and disappointment at their behavior. Parents who had been proud to support their sons' European adventure found themselves fielding calls from neighbors and colleagues who had seen the news coverage and wanted explanations for the disgraceful conduct. The Royal British Legion, the UK's leading armed forces charity, issued a statement condemning the harassment of serving military personnel and highlighting the important role played by the Queen's Guard in maintaining British traditions and security. Their intervention elevated the incident from a tourist offense to a broader discussion about respect for military service. Guardsman Thompson became something of a folk hero in the aftermath of the incident, with his restrained but firm response being praised as an example of professional military bearing under pressure. Military blogs and veterans organizations shared his story as an illustration of the dignity and discipline expected of the Queen's Guard even when facing provocation. The palace's handling of the incident was also widely praised, with security experts noting how effectively the situation had been managed to protect both the institution's dignity and the safety of all involved parties. The swift response and thorough documentation were cited as examples of professional security work at the highest level. Online fundraising campaigns emerged to support military charities in the names of the three Australians, with donors expressing their respect for the Queen's Guard while condemning the tourist behavior. The ironic result was that their actions generated thousands of pounds in donations to causes supporting the very people they had mocked. Death threats and harassment directed at the three friends forced police to increase security at their accommodation and warn them about the dangers of appearing in public. The anger directed toward them was intense and personal, with many people viewing their behavior as an attack on fundamental British values and military honor. International relations experts noted that the incident had created minor diplomatic tensions between Australia and the UK, requiring careful management to prevent broader implications for the country's relationship. The Australian government's quick condemnation of the behavior helped contain the damage, but the incident remained a source of embarrassment in diplomatic circles. Legal commentators predicted that the intense public interest and negative coverage would influence the court's approach to sentencing, potentially resulting in harsher penalties to demonstrate that such behavior would not be tolerated. The need to send a strong message to other potential troublemakers was cited as a factor that would work against the defendants. The incident sparked broader discussions about tourist behavior, social media culture, and the lengths people would go to achieve online fame. Educational institutions began using their case as an example of how poor judgment could have lifelong consequences, particularly when combined with the permanence of internet documentation. Mental health professionals noted the severe psychological impact that such intense negative attention could have on young people, warning about the potential for lasting emotional damage from public shaming campaigns. The three friends were experiencing firsthand how quickly social media fame could transform from blessing to curse.